All right, I think we're ready to go.
Cool.
Great.
Before we start, I wanted to ask, Shannon, I saw that you have like a paper book copy or like a paperback copy of Mexikid, right? So the one I read is a hardcover, and then I also listened to the audiobook because Julie, you suggested that. So I just wanted to see like what like format everyone was reading it in.
Yes.
Paperback as well.
Hardback.
Okay.
For your hardback, does it have on the inside, is it different cover than what is on the cover page? Curiosity.
Nope.
Nope.
Same thing. But I did want to like, I feel like it's still such a new book and it's a library book, that with the pages being so thick and colored and it being a hardback, it honestly does not like stay open well. It's kind of bulky and hard to read, I thought. So like
even the paperback was too, to be honest. It was definitely something where I would have to like hold the pages because it will just naturally.
It's a hardy book.
Yeah, it's definitely that full graphic novel colored everything. Like the amount of ink in this, definitely you can feel.
Yeah, I just thought about that, like going through it. So I didn't even realize that there was a paperback copy of it, you know?
Mm.
All right. So, well, Shannon, you want to ask a question first?
Sure. All right. Let's see here. Let me start. All right. I want to start with the one that drove me nuts throughout the whole story. And it's something super silly. And I'm curious if y'all had noticed it or if it stuck in your head as long as it did with me. Did y'all notice the amount of bananas? And why do you think that the author made that focus of his mother? Is there more to it than just that she likes bananas, or was the connection to how his grandfather ended up eating the snapped banana at the very, very end? Because that was the first time that I saw anybody else with a banana other than constantly just gathering the bananas and passing it out in the grocery bags. But I have multiple yellow stickers to acknowledge the amount. And it might be because I'm an Ocean's 11 fan and like Brad Pitt was constantly in every single scene he was in with Ocean's 11 was always eating something. So I don't know if that was like my mind of like, oh, it says that she absolutely adores bananas. So now I've got to like be searching for bananas on every page that she's a part of. But it did come up a lot. And I was just curious if y'all noticed the same thing or if I'm just an oddball with that one and why it might have happened that way. So it started out with page. Oh, that's right. There's no page. Oh, wait. There it is. Page.
There's
354.
Also, did you notice in the back, this picture, I think the caption said, "There are no fewer than 9.5 bananas in this picture."
Yes. And because I was searching to see if she was holding them in the photos too. So it was like a constant, like I'm looking in the background of every single photo, like where's a banana? Where's a half banana? Is there a whole banana or is that a whole bunch of bananas? It was the most random thing that got me through, like, not that the whole book didn't get me through. It's just that I was constantly searching for bananas ever since that page. So once I hit page 54, it became bananas, the whole book. So, but it ended with
personally,
the grandfather. Go ahead.
Well, personally, I don't feel like I noticed the extreme presence of bananas as much as you did, but I feel like just throughout the book, his mother didn't have like a huge role. So maybe bananas was her thing. You know, I feel like his dad gave like life advice and was like funny and cheap, but I feel like his mother was always just kind of like there.
Could that be because she was only Spanish speaking, didn't speak any English really. So
That's
then
true.
because of that combination and everything of English, Spanish, and then like here, bananas,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is like his go-to because they did have some conversations and everything and the deer story. That was an interesting part of her coming out and just being like, all right, this is old school. Like, this is how we do, like, when there is no like technology around, no hospitals or anything. We do this on the farm. So let's go. But otherwise, it was very minimalistic for at least vocal points and everything like that. So maybe that was just to like constantly make sure that he was acknowledging his mom in those scenes.
Yeah.
It's a graphic memoir, which is like by genre creative nonfiction, and so oftentimes like it's important to show not tell kind of like personality traits and characteristics, and so maybe this was just kind of like the concrete specific detail that he was offering in his mom kind of symbolically. I hadn't really noticed. I mean, I definitely noticed that there were bananas mentioned, but it wasn't one of those things where I was like on the active hunt. But also, you did spark me Googling what a banana symbolizes just to get a little deeper with it. Hold on, where is it? It's be enjoying the moment, which could be a lesson that Pedro learned on his road trip with his family, because there were a lot of times that he was ready for like what's next, what's next. But there were other times like fireworks, which I'll mention because I asked questions about that as well, where he just needs to like not worry about what's going to happen next and kind of take time to enjoy the present moment around him and not be worried about like future expectations. But yeah, I think on like it could be that it's like intended for kind of YA. And I remember Julie mentioning the last time we met that you have a student who reads it over and over and over again. Could be one of those things that like maybe a kid doesn't read until the second or third time that they're reading the book, and then they get to kind of approach it from a new angle with like a different story, kind of the way you did, Shannon, where you're like, oh my God, look, another banana. It's kind of added a little razzle dazzle to it.
Well, I just thought it was just bananas because my husband and I like to travel a lot, and I mean the bananas that come out of that part of Mexico are just wonderful. I mean, there's a lot of bananas in that part of the world, and when you eat them down in Mexico or in further into Central America, Costa Rica, anywhere like that, they're just they're much better than they are here because they actually have to ripen on the way here and they take them off the trees earlier. But if you get them down there and they're ripe, they're fantastic. They're right there. But so I think maybe he just likes bananas. And he appreciated that out of his mom that she it's the perfect fruit. It comes prepackaged in its own wrapper. You can it's one of those things that I don't mind when a kid gives me a banana. I don't mind eating it because it's not like they can truly contaminate the fruit. And
Yeah.
it's the perfect fruit as far as I'm concerned because of that. And I think maybe he just likes bananas.
Also, what a
One
parent
other
move.
thing
Go ahead.
no, for real, to have it all over. One thing I noticed too, like, and just thought of, because Shannon, you mentioned something about like at the very end, like the grandpa has a banana in his hand, and then he was eating the bananas on the road trip quite a bit. And it just like makes me think of my grandparents too. They, because of like the time they grew up in, like they're not gonna waste food. So maybe to Pedro, he's like, ugh, not eating these bananas. I don't want them. But like to the grandpa, maybe it's just like, here's the food I have. Like I'm gonna eat it. I don't know. So maybe that's why he's the
Right?
one
Half
who
banana or not half banana, it's in my hand,
yeah,
so I'm gonna eat it.
exactly.
Well, I did like how they
Exactly.
said that half banana was gross.
Mhm.
Because like I said, it's got its own carrying case if it's whole, but without it, I'm not going to take one from a kid if it's a half banana. Forget that.
Fair enough.
You've opened it up to contamination.
Mhm.
But it's also just like classic parent move. Can we stop
Right.
here? Can we stop there for snacks? No, we have snacks. And it's
Right.
just a banana.
Spam and bananas.
May, you want to go next?
Sure. So my first question I had here was there was a clear divide between the barn babies and the hospital babies in the story, and how did this like distinction help add to the story? So, there's like a whole page on, I think, page 36, where he like really lays it out and they really like start talking about like barn babies, hospital babies. But then, throughout the whole book, they go back to mentioning it and then just, talk about the older siblings, the younger siblings. So just like, how do you think that specific distinction added to the story?
The poop story. Another lesson learned. It's like one of those, it's part of it goes along with one of my questions too, about like how there's like every sibling, there's some type of story lesson or knowledge that's gained from somebody who's mentioned something. And with the hospital babies versus the barn babies, the ability to like enjoy some ice cream in Mexico, or you're just going to have a poop fest. So it's one of those where I think that was like oh, look, this is what happens when, and it went through the whole explanation too, with why and everything too. But I think that had a lot to do with it, because that enhanced the poop story even more. Like it became a lesson learned at that point, not just, ha ha ha, you're a barn baby or you're a hospital baby.
I also asked a question kind of related to the siblings, which we'll circle back on. But my biggest focus is that like they're all kind of foils for one another. So he goes on page 167 when the teenagers are embarking and they're going to go home by themselves. He kind of explains like all of the traits that each of them has, and how he's worried that like he, being kind of a younger American born sibling, like may not possess that. Like Sal had cool logic, Ruth had ghost business savvy, sage wisdom. So it kind of puts it in perspective. It like gets you thinking about like what characteristics Pedro has, although he wasn't a barn baby, he's a hospital baby. They kind of unravel implicitly like some of the things. Well, Pedro's got charisma and he's horrible with money. So he's definitely more of like a personality hire. But that's a good catch, that he does kind of, there is that divide between the siblings for sure.
Yeah, I asked a very similar question about why do you think it's important that Pedro distinguished between his siblings who were somewhat American and those who were somewhat Mexican? Because I think they talked about it about the same time when he was talking about barn babies versus hospital babies. And to me, it was more of it kind of a cultural identity thing, where in this whole book, I think Pedro is dealing with his cultural identity and how it's shaped by his experiences and his surroundings. So to me, his older siblings seem to hold on to some more traditional customs, while he and his younger siblings were able to assimilate more toward American culture. And so, it brings into what Laurel was talking about their different characteristics. And you can see how the older siblings kind of tended toward more things that might be considered more Hispanic type things, and the younger ones tended toward more American type things. So that's how I kind of interpreted it when I was thinking about my question that was similar.
It's also kind of important
Yeah.
that like we're hearing the story from Pedro's perspective, which I talk about later. So we get his kind of, not necessarily discomfort, I would say, but unfamiliarity with Mexico in the way that like his siblings don't share, but that's how they could feel about America. We just don't get it from their point of view. But like definitely, like you said, Julie, there's that like cultural divide of kind of like how and where you were raised. And I mean the whole point I think of the comic, and he touches on it in the end, is like he's, a little bit of this and a little bit of this, but like 100% Mexikid. So yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Great answers, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I feel like a little bit of what everyone said is kind of what I was thinking too. And it just was also kind of interesting how I think the barn babies were, they were all the older ones too, who also got to, travel in a different truck, and without them, they didn't have to do that, the RV. Whereas like the younger ones, the hospital babies were in the RV, and it almost felt like two different like whole stories. Like I feel like we did not learn much about the older ones because they were traveling in the different, caravan or different vehicle and everything. But
And I think that's how a lot of bigger families go too, because especially with, like, for example, my niece is 17 and my nephew is 10. So there's going to be a lot of things that, she's going to be able to do that he can't. So splitting it is going to not only reduce the amount of arguments, but it's also going to allow one to feel a little bit more, like, okay, we're giving you that trust and that responsibility. Show us how we've taught you. And then for the younger one to say, look, this is where you'll go if XYZ too. So
yeah.
Julie, you want to go, or do you want me to go?
Well, I think my first question was so much like May's. I'm gonna, what like I was saying, mine was the difference between the somewhat American and somewhat Mexican. So, I mean, I guess I can build on that. Why do you think it was important to Pedro to distinguish between his siblings who were somewhat American and those were somewhat Mexican? If you have any more you'd like to add on to that.
I think it's mainly about the experiences and what they're having to go through in Mexico too, like with the hay load up and then understanding the grave sites. And like somebody who's here in America, for example, was born and raised, is not necessarily thinking about going and having to dig layers of grave sites and everything like that too. Like that's definitely more of a rural type of scenario, definitely more, historic, like age is a big part of it too. So I think that just the different cultures on how we've come up and have learned and figured out how grave sites should be to like reduce the flooding and things like that too. Not necessarily have they done that in other countries. So I think that's a big part of it too, is seeing how the, almost like third world type of thing, that setting. And understanding that concept, and they've lived it and they felt it before, so they're more understanding and able to just jump in, whereas others would be like, what is happening here?
Mm-hmm.
There's also such
and I feel like, go ahead, Laurel.
There's such a thin like geographical divide. I mean, like based loosely on the map on this page, like between Mexico to America is like a jump, skip, and a hop away. It doesn't feel like it's. I mean, obviously, he kind of paints the picture of going through customs or whatever it is, the border is a super stressful time, but like it's just a line, and then you cross it, and then you're in another world, is what it feels like as he describes it. So that could also just kind of like tie geographically into like familial. There's such a thin line of difference between the two of them, but like they're still in the same family. They still kind of like share that same commonality, that common ground, in the same way that like one could argue Mexico and America, same thing. Like we share a hunk of land. It's not like you're taking a ship to get from one place to another. And yet within that can be such vast differences. And I think that speaks really well to like families, kind of that like archetypal black sheep. Like try as you might, you can make the most uniform family you want, but there's always going to be one kid that's like a little bit different or a little weird. And I think Pedro touches on that nicely.
Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh, we touched on with age too. I mean, it's like this in every family. The older sibling is kind of like the guide for, different things. But I feel like with that somewhat American and somewhat Mexican, those older siblings are truly like the guides for Pedro and like help introduce him to things and teach him to things, because I can't remember if he had ever been to Mexico before. I can't quite remember, but I feel like this was his first like experience fully like remembering it, so he I feel like he just learned so much from them while they were there too.
especially in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Okay, great, yeah.
Alrighty. When did Pedro, or Americanized Peter, learn his greatest lesson on the road trip? Obviously subjective. There is no one answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it was a collective amount of knowledge that then created who his identity was. I think that it took multiple experiences, as it does with all of us, to figure out who we are. And even at his young age, he had gone through so many different like lessons and gained knowledge about certain things. And from not only learning about, just how life is over in Mexico, but also about his family and his background and understanding like who he came from, and then finding ways to make sure that they basically interlace, like they're gonna lock together, and that it's creating one person for him. And I think that's where the full knowledge of who he is came about, because of the collective amount of experiences and that long journey together with family, and having all of those new things happening were important to just kind of revelations for him time and time again.
Laura, what did you say your question was, just so I can word it the
No, you're
same?
good. So when in the book, and it's kind of a matter almost of like looking inward in a way too. Like when, as the reader, did you think Pedro learned his like greatest lesson?
Okay. Then what I at least was the most impactful to me, was after they buried or like dug up his grandmother. It's page 202, 203. And his brother had like walked home, and I feel like up until this point, like so many parts of the book were just so lighthearted and silly, and this just got so serious. And then you saw it in Pedro too, like he's laying his hand on the coffin with his grandfather, and then when he gets back, he asks his brother if he's okay, and his brother's like, I just wanted to lay down. And Pedro, he asks, was it too much sun? But we know that that's not really what he was asking. And he knows that's not what he was asking. And I feel like the brother knows that too. And he was like, yeah, it was too much sun. And they just all have that like collective understanding of it was just a really emotionally tolling day. And so I feel like that's what stood out to me the most.
Yeah.
All right, to me, it was kind of it was around the time when his siblings decided that they needed to get back to school and travel back home by themselves in the truck, and his sister tells him to step up and be strong. And he kind of makes that connection that he, that he is a huge part of this family, whereas before I think he thought he was just the little barrel guy, that they all picked on, made fun of. He was the one that was, uh, he didn't feel like he got much respect. He thought that they squirted him with the little pee-pee man kind of, and and but I think once they get into the next town and he sees his whole family, and he gets that sense of how huge it is, and he realizes that his grandfather's a real guy, not just this superhero guy, and that they all have a place. And I think that's when he feels like he's found his place.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mhm.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Um,
I feel like he was like the Julie touching on that, he was like the, a middle child, and then when they had to leave and go back to school, he became like the oldest child, so then he kind of had to step up in that place.
Which is almost like foreshadowing for when, they go off to school and careers, and then kind of slowly but surely all of the children in the family get their chance at being the oldest. That's a good interpretation too.
Yeah.
My answer differed slightly, but it just kind of resonated with me, and it also ironically ties back into the banana conversation. After buying the fake fireworks, and he asks his grandfather to like go beat the kid up because he spent way too much money on paper. His grandfather's like, money is not worth dying over, dude. No, I'm not gonna do that. But then later that night, he gets real fireworks, and he wasn't expecting it. And it's kind of that beauty in realizing that something that we want can't always be planned, and there's relief almost in it being like a pleasant surprise because you can't foresee it and build up all these expectations. You just let it happen to you, and it's really awesome to be in like that present moment, like the banana. And nothing is forced. It's executed spectacularly, as he describes it. And so that's kind of an important lesson for a lot of kids to learn, because I think we're all, when we're 10, we want to be 11. When we're 11, we want to be 12. When we're 12, so on and so forth. That just kind of like grounding children and reminding them it's okay to just live in the present moment. You don't need to worry about tomorrow. You don't need to worry about a year from now. It's kind of just a refreshing take on like the innocence of childhood and being present in wherever you are.
I like that.
Thanks. I needed that lesson myself.
Yeah, I'm learning that that youth was definitely wasted when I was young.
I've been told my entire life. I just turned 25, and I'm like, everything hurts now.
Wait till you get over 50.
Duly noted.
Yeah, I hit 40 this year, so I was definitely feeling it too.
All right, I think Shannon, it's your turn.
All right. So, why weren't the Spanish speaking conversations between adults always translated? So, although typically a lot of them that weren't translated were in gray font to kind of show that it was background conversation, can we explain why some of those conversations were important enough to put in the memoir, but not enough to translate?
Well, I think he's a kid, and he didn't understand Spanish. So it's the book is told from his point of view, and at that point he probably had no clue what they were saying. He just knew that they were having an adult conversation, and it was probably something he didn't really need to know if it wasn't translated, and something that may or may not have made a difference to him, but it was important enough for the adults, and he was just showing that he's the kid, he doesn't understand Spanish, and that's the way it is. I took it literally.
I also feel like you could use context clues a lot of the time too, with it being a graphic novel of like, Julie, like you said, he didn't understand. So what he was probably doing was taking those context clues too. So maybe that just translates to what the reader has to do in some of those situations.
It could also be that even in our native language as children, we don't always understand what our parents are talking about. Could also be that maybe they were talking about things that were inappropriate for young readers, but he didn't want to like omit them entirely from the book because it's an important piece of information that he would overhear his parents talking about, but knowing at the same time like very few young readers are going to go actively search Google Translate like what the Spanish is. I thought about doing it, but I didn't circle back around to it. But they could be like really important heavy pieces of dialogue that are just, as non-native Spanish speakers, like just going right over our head. But
The Charlie
native
Brown.
language, like he might have had what his parents were talking about.
Okay, are we ready for the next question? Anyone have anything to add?
Take it away.
Cool. I'll go next. So mine, my question was similar to the one about like which experience stood out to you the most. But I said on page 302, Pedro and his sister talked about how they did a lot of growing up on this trip. And what are some of the things that stood out to you that made it feel like he was growing up? So we kind of touched on, I feel like, maybe some of those experiences, but if anyone has anything to add. Just feel like this was kind of like the reflection of the book, you know, and kind of telling like, you know, wrapping it all up, you may have felt like, oh, he's learning about himself and his culture and his tradition and, you know, learning a lot from all these experiences. But I feel like this conversation just kind of ties that all up. And if that's not what you were understanding from the book, you know, if that's not what like a child might have got from it if they were reading it, I feel like this kind of says that out loud, you know? So just looking back, what were some of those things that made him grow up?
I think the scene where he spends too much money on the cookie is a big one. For two reasons. One, we learned, like I said, that he's not financially responsible and he has no business with Mexican dollars. But two, that like that was kind of his first soiree with love, which is, I mean, an omnipresent theme. Like love is never gonna die. Everyone's obsessed with it. And that was his first kind of kick in the teeth that he spent all of this money on like an oversized stale cookie, and the girl of his dreams for that moment like still didn't want him. But he also like takes it like a champ, which really helps kind of shape his character and who he is. He's like, it's not that deep. I'm gonna eat the cookie. There will be other women. There will be other girls.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, albeit like compared to some of the more heavy themes of the book with him growing, you know, talking about like mortality and saving creatures like the deer, it's definitely a lighter moment. But I think that also matches the coming of age like theme and genre really well, because love is always in a coming of age story, and his was brief, but it was still present.
I think one of the first things to me on the road trip that really smacked him in the face was it. I could sense the terror when they got stopped at the border and got pulled over, and you know, even though he was more worried about not having his superheroes and you know not having all of the stuff that he had priced for the Kmart store and that sort of thing. I think, you know, knowing that they really could have been in some serious trouble, um, and you know him feeling like he's mostly American and not understanding what's really going on at that point. That was the first time he'd really had that confrontation. I think it anything like that in your life is going to be a when you do have sort of that traumatic experience is really going to sit with you for a while. So if you put that along with, um, you know, when they're coming back and you know, thinking about possibly running out of gas and you know, what are they going to do? You know, I think he's learning that we deal with situations as they come, that we have to trust in people who have been there, done it before, instead of trying to make up the rules as we go along, and that we've got to. I think he learned how important it was to really have that trust in the people you love, and to know that yeah, things may look dire, but we're going to come out at the end. We're family.
Yeah, I think that he had a positive outlook in most situations too, as things adjusted, no matter what came about, whether it be at the border, whether it be the deer situation, whether it be, you know, running out of gas, whether it be, you know, no matter what situation came, he also was constantly looking to see what his family members were doing. And I think he was taking on like kind of notes because he was trying to mimic that. So like towards the end, when they got back and were recrossing the border, he already had certain tools that were up his sleeve to kind of process it a lot easier and to be able to kind of stand up and be a man, you know, and, you know, handle things in a way that just gets them through and helps that process along. And I think he gained even more confidence because of all the knowledge that he gained too.
Yeah, his first border crossing experience and his second one were, you know, vastly different, but also having that like experience from that first one, you could sense that when they were going into the second one, he was kind of nervous. And so he was just like preparing himself for another, you know, semi-traumatic experience, and then was just so pleasantly surprised when it went so smoothly.
That's how TSA feels. It's like fight or flight.
Oh my god. Yes, every time. Do I take my laptop out? Do I not? I don't know.
Is my build on or off?
They're gonna yell at me either way.
Yeah. That's why you got to get the pre-pass or whatever it's called.
It does seem worth it.
All right, my question. I loved Pedro's grandfather and kind of the mystique about him. But why is it important to Pedro to learn some of his grandfather's cool hero knowledge?
Well, I think that a big part of it was about his just fascination with comics already and with graphics, and just realizing, I think that was the way for him to finally connect to his family heritage, was because it's like, did you know that he did this? And then of course, because he's already so creative and already does these little drawings and creations and loves to like mimic and act things out with his action figures. And I think that that has a lot to do with it, because now he can be able to absorb his storytelling with his grandfather and create something from that. So I think that just uplifted his spirits to find out more details, to figure out how he could be able to like be connected and be a superhero himself, or at least related to one.
Yeah, I feel like Grandpa was kind of like a legend to him too. You know, he didn't know him personally, so then um he just wanted to find out like the coolest things about his grandfather like right away. You know, he didn't really um seem to care about the small details. And then uh the story about how when the grandmother like passed away of like I think an aneurysm, or you know, the brain freeze, and then his father said something about like, oh, his other siblings, and then that gave Pedro a moment to like reflect and be like, I didn't realize how much hardship that my dad went through. And then that, you know, relates back to his grandfather too, like how much hardship he went through. And so Pedro was so like hyper fixated on like, I want to learn all the cool stuff that he did. um and so I feel like that, I don't know, it also just shows him growing throughout the story too. He focuses on like the cool things, but then throughout the story he learns a lot more of like the smaller things that really make up who a person is.
I think it could also tie back to that cultural divide. Being, I mean, like his grandfather is 100% Mexican born and raised. So if we're looking at just like culture and, you know, basic belief systems and practices that like each kind of respectfully subscribes to, obviously there's also a huge age difference between the two of them. It's going to be like sweepingly different. So it could very well just be like kind of similarly, I think it's what May said. He was like a superhero, so he's just going to try to figure out as much as he could that he has in common with this man that arguably he like really doesn't have that much in common with, aside from just being a family member. It's kind of, you know, it again, it kind of like shapes who Pedro is as a person. Like he strikes me as the kind of character who's like never met a stranger. He's gonna initiate a conversation with you one way or another. And it just so happens that the focus on this trip is his grandfather. And arguably much to his like grandfather's chagrin in some cases, because obviously he's an older guy, he just wants to be left alone. But Pedro's like, no, I'm gonna get to know you.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of y'all. I think that learning about his grandfather helped him connect with his family's cultural and historical heritage, and it helped him learn more about his Mexican identity. But like you said, Laurel, I think it also strengthened his relationship with his grandfather too, and appreciating who he was.
It's also that like juxtaposition. I think I'm using that correctly. I might not be, but it's the expectations versus reality, like who you think someone's going to be, and then you want them to live up to that, and then they don't, and you're like, all right, but we're gonna make it work. You're gonna have some kind of fantastical quality, especially as a kid. You're gonna have some kind of fantastical quality that I've attributed to you, whether you possess it or not.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, he did that. Oh goodness, I feel like it was when they first started their road trip back home or something, when he was making comics, and then he was like, the grandpa was talking, and he was like, okay, dot dot dot. 8 minutes later, then grandpa said something, but in his comic, he was like, he's doing all this cool stuff. So
Alrighty, back to me.
Yep.
Okay, so we kind of already touched on this. This was my discussion of his teenage siblings, but why did Pedro's teenage siblings seem so excited to head home early from the road trip?
I think a lot of it is the maturity and understanding that they have already been there and been through experiences, knowing that things have kind of summed up for the most part, but there were still little bits that needed to be done, but still showing their responsibility. Like they've already were mature enough to drive there on their own. So they're now saying, hey, we still need to stand up for ourselves and be responsible. Yes, we've been here to help family, but we also need to get back so that we can continue our own journey and be able to be the responsible beings and go to school. And the reason why we probably came to America was to better ourselves and get educated. So we need to do that.
Nice.
See, I just took it as mom and dad were pretty smart, knowing that the older kids would probably be getting tired of the younger kids and be getting tired of hanging out with all of the relatives because they're teenagers and just want to get back to doing their thing in their place. And they didn't want to hang out with the rest of the family. They were a group unto themselves. They're happy with them, with each other, and they just want to get back. And using school as an excuse was the perfect way to get back.
Yeah.
um, and kids that age, they know how to work it. And yeah, they were mature enough to get down there on their own. Their parents trusted them to get back. So I do think it's also exemplifies the amount of trust that the parents had put into the older siblings. And that probably has something to do with the fact that they were mostly Mexican, and that, the older kids and the Mexican heritage take on more responsibility, and, they're more likely to like be raising their younger siblings while the parents are working and that sort of thing. So I do think that mostly Mexican culture thing does have a lot to do with it as well.
yeah, on a much like lighter note too, like Pedro mentions it in like a narrator blurb. It says like, even though I knew they just wanted to go home to be unsupervised teens for a couple of weeks. And I mean, very valid, right? Like,
Yeah.
you and your four siblings have the opportunity to not have mom and dad around in the 70s. Like, I feel like that is also just could play into there. They'd have some unsupervised time.
Yep. And
And I will say too, as a child of the 70s and 80s, we didn't have the same restraints on us that you guys had in this century. I mean, I was a latchkey kid when I was in kindergarten. I came home, opened the door by myself. I was in charge of my younger brother who was 4 years old, and nobody even thought twice. We went outside, we played, we came home when it was dark. Or hopefully came home when it was dark. We didn't tell our parents everywhere we're going. We didn't have cell phones so they could check up on us all the time. So, I mean, yeah, that was pretty normal.
Also
Yeah.
true.
I also think that a lot of it also is because such a big family, them being able to have the opportunity to have fewer people around is also like that opportunity to finally be able to breathe a little bit too. They've had so much responsibility. They're going to continue having so much responsibility, having that little gap in between and everything, being able to still, I do feel that because of their background, I feel that they probably were still focused on school as part of it, but there is still the other side of being able to be a teenager, be at home without the parents, and just being able to be like, oh, breathe without kids running around and screaming, not having to eat, half of bananas and spam all the time. You can actually eat what you want, and, being able to do their own thing, I think has a lot to do with it too, for sure.
Yeah, and that as far as answers go, like that definitely takes up the first two bulletins that I made, which were I definitely talked about they just wanted to be unsupervised teens for a couple of weeks. It also kind of denotes that like they're respected as young adults by their parents, which also kind of like further implies the age gaps between the siblings, better explaining the dynamic that they have, which we've touched on. I said it also kind of introduces though this idea of inherent bias when telling a story from only one perspective. Pedro's acknowledging that he's younger, and it could be argued that he's envious that his older siblings are allowed to go, and he's kind of painting it that they're super excited to go on this adventure. And even Pedro admits that like he was a little bit nervous for them, but he assumes that they're not feeling any nerves at all, when in reality, like we don't know because the story's not told from their perspective. We don't get their perspective. They didn't seem nervous when they were telling the story of how their car ran out of liquid and they used the like little pee man to save the day. But at the same time, I mean, maybe a brother was nervous or a sister was nervous, and we don't know that, which kind of like brings us back to this is told from Pedro's perspective. So we're only getting his commentary on this trip as a whole. And that's, I mean, an important piece of storytelling to teach kids, I think.
Definitely.
All right, Shannon, it's back to you.
All right. So, although mentioned multiple times and it was pretty continuous, basically his size differing from his siblings, why do you think that it was not something that was really handled at any point in time? He was vocal about many things, but that topic he just always moved on each time as if it didn't bother him. But it being mentioned so often, it's like it obviously affected him. So what could have held him from going further into like whether or not, we don't know if he did talk to his mom about it or anything like that, or talk to his siblings about him being called, the barrel-sized kid, and things like that. But why do you think that it was not something, maybe it was within the 800 pages, I don't know, that was minimized to the 300, but why do you feel that it wasn't, or why do you think that he held back from going into further details about how that made him feel versus just mentioning it like over like 15 times?
Wow. Respect to the sticky notes. Those are nice. That's a nice reference.
Color coded.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I will comment. I think it's interesting that you referenced that because we could even tie that into kind of our discussion of big and just like the expectations that we place on like young girls versus boys as far as weight and how they present. Obviously it's jokes are made that he's a barrel-sized kid, but then in the same breath, like no one tells him he needs to like eat differently or change anything about his diet or role or exercise, anything like that. It's just kind of a light-hearted, passive comment. Obviously, you made a note. It left an impact on him. But it could just be that he's a young boy and his parents are like, yeah, this is the barrel-sized kid, and it's for a laugh for sure, which he could be using in the book as well. But if it were told from a girl's perspective, I think it would be an entirely different context or results surrounding it, and the story wouldn't be about the family going on a road trip. It would be about like the girl grappling with body issues. So there's definitely like that kind of divide between young boys and young girls addressed by his laissez-faire response to it.
I'm wondering too, though, kind of the opposite, Laurel,
Okay.
where if you think about Hispanic culture, you do see a lot of larger kids,
Fair
and
enough.
perhaps it's not something that they really, that they distinguish him by being barrel sized because the other kids were skinny. So maybe it really wasn't that much of
An insult.
an insult. It was just truly just a description.
Huh.
I'm not sure, but I think it could. I don't.
That's a compelling point, though, for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I really thought what you said, Laurel, was like really profound.
Thanks.
And about how it would be so different, from a girl's perspective. And I do think that oh gosh, what was I thinking? What I was going to say? I feel like boys too, a lot of, and boys and girls, but I think of this one boy I went to middle school with, and he was like, I mean, through middle school, he was like a barrel sized kid. And then we got to high school and he shot up to like 6 foot and thinned out. Like, I mean, he wasn't like an athlete, but it's not like he put a ton of work into thinning out. It was just like his hormones and everything, So, I don't know. I feel like because they didn't go into depth, on these like insults he's getting too, I just don't know if it truly bothered him that much. But I mean, maybe it did. I don't know.
Your mic's turned
We
on.
can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry. I double clicked. So I really feel that the way that I was reading and everything, the way that it was said, and his facial reactions and the actual like images of him responding kind of made me feel that it was something that he did take in. He just kind of has that attitude of okay, we're just going to keep on moving forward, but it like bothers him in the moment. But because it was so continuous, I really, how like there are some movies that you just predict the ending and you're like, oh, it's going to end up like this. It's the same thing with a lot of books too. But it's like you already are seeing all of this with the graphics, and it's like, oh, I was really expecting the grandfather, like after they've lived together and everything and have gotten back to America, I really was expecting him to say, and my grandfather or my abuelo now thinks that I'm not just some barrel-sized kid, that we both have related together. Like I really thought that was going to be that powerful ending too, connecting it, because it was brought up so many times throughout every single chapter basically, and I just felt that it was just kind of just floated away, and I was like, what happened? Where are we going? Is there another like, where are we going to the next one? Is it Mexikid 2 that I'm now going to be reading into, and then we're going to go in depth to it, so I just felt like I fell off a cliff at that point. It's just, there was no bridge to the ending at that. And although there was, obviously it summed up a lot of great things, that was one piece that was missing because it had been happening so much throughout the story that I just felt was dropped. So
True.
I like that
maybe it was just left out, like you said, for Mexikid 2, or maybe it was just like, maybe that's not what we want to deal with in this story.
Yeah. I honestly went through the Instagram to see if it was like mentioned in like any of his posts or previous comics and things like that he's written individually, to see if there was going to be something written about it. I was like, come on, there's got to be like, there's reason behind these words.
I like that you talked about how the facial expressions tied into maybe like his emotional reaction to it, because that is a major piece to reading a graphic novel. Is you're looking, I mean, arguably same thing for picture books, you're looking for things that aren't told in text. And because a graphic novel focuses so heavily on illustrations like color palette, emotion, a lot of what we talked about for Big, I can say I didn't notice his emotional reaction to passive comments like that. So that was a good one.
And it could be just similar to Big, that I just relate to it more. So maybe it just took on more of that side of my personal experiences and why it absorbed into me. Don't know about the banana thing. But, with the size, the barrel size and things like that, I mean, I just kept on picturing, like what my neighbors and friends would say and adults would say to me too. So it was just kind of, I guess, more of that relative like connection to what was going on in the story. And I was just prepared for like a yeah, and there was a wee cliffhanger. Where are we going? I'm just holding on to the branch.
I've got a nephew-in-law, I guess, who he's Border Patrol in Texas, and he's Hispanic. His name's Carlos, and Carlos was one of those barrel-shaped kids, and he now looks like Shrek, if you can imagine that. And we all tell him that, so he knows. I mean, this is nothing, but so that's why I'm kind of like, well, it's normal in his family. It really is. He's got, his mom is a large woman. He's a large man. His father's a large man. And everybody I've met in that family, well, not everybody. There's a couple that are really skinny, but most of them are just, they've eaten way too many tamales, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I will get into my next question. The author chose to write his memoir as a graphic novel. How do you think that makes the story more appealing, especially because, when reading, I feel like it didn't even feel like a nonfiction book a lot of the time. I could see someone reading this or writing this purely for enjoyment, and it wouldn't be a real story. So, why do you think he chose to write his memoir in this way?
I asked a similar question, May. How could you? How could you take my question?
Well, two
I-
for one.
I
Well,
asked a similar question too.
I will say though, I made a
wrote
note.
this. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Who's going? Okay. On the first page, if I can find it, it says that, like, this book is a work of fiction. Any references to historical events, real people, or real places are used fictitiously. So I thought that was interesting that there is a nod that, like, maybe it says a graphic memoir on it, which is nonfiction, as we know, but I wasn't sure if there were elements that were fabricated, which is just a note too, because you mentioned that it's technically nonfiction. And I subscribe to that as well, but I thought that was interesting. But to answer your question, hold on, let me circle. Okay, so graphic novels are appealing for the intended age. With the existence of more popular graphic novels, the stigma against them that they're not real literature may eventually be diminished. I remember how many graphic novels were available growing up when I was a kid. It was like Raina Telgemeier's Smile, and anything else that was by her published after like the few next years. For kids, I mean, there were some obviously for adults. We talked about Neil Gaiman's is it The Graveyard? No. Sandman series. Last time we met very briefly. But there is kind of this idea in literature that graphic novels aren't worthy of reading, when in reality, like, they're this really unique art form, and like, kids enjoy reading them. And if we're getting kids to read, there's nothing wrong with them. It's also, yeah, it's cool that he used this as a graphic memoir because the only other graphic memoir, or he used this format for a memoir because the only other graphic memoir I can think about is Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which like kids obviously are not going to read that. That is not for children. So hold on, let me go back. Also, yeah, and then the point is that Pedro Martinez drew comics, so it makes sense that that would be the tie-in. Okay.
Mhm.
So
I wanted to touch on Laurel. I just have to step away, 2 steps away. So I read Gut for my other graphic novel for
I
the
have it too.
annotated
Great book.
book. And it is a young adult graphic novel biography, categorized in our library. So I thought it was interesting that I was reading both of these at the same time, and they were both graphic novel like biographies.
Biography.
Yeah.
Is Smile in that? Is it also a graphic novel biography?
Yep. I think so. I think
Yeah.
loosely. I think it's supposed to be, but I think same thing. Like maybe
I think
similarly.
it tells them together. So
Yeah.
it must be in that biography like category. But yeah, I don't know. Like you said, he was a cartoonist, and I did read into some of his like interviews and how and after I, came up with this question, how he liked to draw little comics, and I feel like it was a way for him to, he drew inspiration from himself and the funny bits that he has experienced with his family. And so I feel like it was an awesome way for him to put it all together. And like you said, um, if kids like to read graphic novels, then, like let them read.
So one thing that y'all had asked was, is everything 100% true because of that very beginning part? I don't know, maybe in the hardbacks, I don't know if it has it, but some of your questions answered in the back of my book. So the last one is, are the things in this story 100% true? And it says, I'd like to say that my stories are 100% true 90% of the time. My memory and my heart like to play tricks on each other. The results are what makes my stories. So it's that combination of memory versus also because he had talked about relating like in the very back with the acknowledgments about like talking to his family about getting the story straight and trying to get from others' perspectives and everything, and how he has a couple of people who constantly are wanting him to tell the story about, the poop story, or to tell the story about the deer story and things like that. So he's like been able to like kind of get together with everybody who was involved and being able to put it in here, but then he has certain memories and certain things that just kind of maybe are elaborated or extended a little bit into the fictional part, just because it's just where his mind was. He was already so creative to begin with. I mean, thinking about all of the superhero actions that his grandfather did in wartime, and it was him, bringing food across the border, which is super important too, but it wasn't necessarily like that combat type of battle for what his grandfather was involved with. So I think that that has a lot to do with it too. So although it's put as fiction, or was it, because I don't know, in my library, I thought, I'll have to look it up. So I don't know, Julie, if you had anything to add, but I'm going to look it up in mine real quick because I thought that I had seen it.
Yeah, I think your memories are your reality. However you remember something, it may not be exactly the way it was, but that's your reality right there. And so I love that he does say, may not be 100% true, but it's how I think of it. And when you think of how, I think he puts it into a story that a younger kid, 5th grade, 6th grade could understand, going on this road trip, and making it a graphic novel was perfect, because if you're going to put it in writing, I mean, I think when I think of road trips, I think of like vacation and the all those Chevy Chase movies where he's going across the country and that sort of thing, you know, and the humor of it and the fun of it. And I think if you're writing about it, because I asked a similar question, I think if you're writing about it, it would be very difficult to get all of the humor without the facial expressions. It would be very difficult to get at the pain of digging up your wife's bones without being able to see it. I think seeing those, you know, how he dug up the grave and that sort of thing. I think seeing that is much more powerful, especially if you're a kid, because I don't know that they could necessarily understand all of the vocabulary and all of the nuances if this was turned into a novel. I think it would have also had to be the 800 pages instead of the 300, just to get at all of the
Yeah.
emotions and all of the descriptions that you have to
Descriptions,
have.
yeah.
I think that was really important.
So I did
Yeah,
look it
Julie,
up
I
in my
touched on that
library.
too. Oh, go ahead.
Mine does say juvenile biography for the Mexikid. So our tech services did label it as biography for graphic novels and for juvenile.
Word. Thanks for checking on that.
Yeah. Oh, Julie, what you said about, you know, the graphics adding to it. I just feel like some of those experiences that they talk about just were made more impactful and like more powerful with a graphic, like you said, and especially with that language barrier. You know, there were some things that, because I'm not a Spanish speaking person, and so some of those things too were made easier to understand with the addition of a picture, you know, right there of it. So
Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask the same question again. I asked, do you think Mexikid would have been as effective at relating the impact of the road trip to bring Pedro's abuelito to the United States? If it would have been as effective had it been written as a novel instead of a graphic novel?
I don't think as many kids would be drawn to it. I think this is a really good way of introducing children to nonfiction, to biography, because when you think about what we're, at least I can speak for myself, like what we were introduced to read as biography, it was like learn about Benjamin Franklin. And, you know, kids don't care about stuff like that. That's boring. But like a charming little kid on a vacation with his family in kind of a vintagey color palette. Absolutely. And again, you know, to tie in I think it's really cool that Julie, you mentioned the student who's read this a few times, because I think that speaks volumes to how obviously I'm imagining, all enjoyed it. Imagine, like, I'm sure a kid enjoys it 10 times more than we did. They're the intended audience. So I think, yeah, this is a wonderful read and introduction to biography and memoir for kids. And I don't think if it were an 800-page solely written nonfiction piece, it would have the same appeal.
I also agree too that the graphics allow it to also be touching on diversity with different cultures and things like that. And especially with that merger of the Spanish culture, Mexican culture coming over with America and having that so prevalent within the States too. I think for children to be able to like see images that they can relate to a lot more is a really important factor, and being able to just be able to have that mirror opportunity and to be able to, you know, make it relevant to them, seeing that context from, you know, from, I mean, all of the images. I mean, you can see in the facial expressions and everything, just that different way of life, and also just how they live and how they act and how they look. All of those things, I think, really make an impact. And that would be hard to really show, like Julie said, with the details in a regular novel.
All right.
Next question. Are we moving
Yep,
on?
next question.
Okay. The first half of this next question is what we've already discussed, and it's format. So I'll ask what I was gonna kind of designate as my follow-up question. And we touched on this, but we didn't really go into great detail with it. But is there a scene depicted in the book where you think that it being a graphic novel heightens or enhances Martinez's storytelling?
I,
You
I
know,
do think that it helped that you could see the whole digging up the grave scene.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would have been really difficult writing about it, because you really need, that's something that I can see it as a movie, and I think it would have been, so much. I think if it had been a novel, they would have had to write so many pages about that, and just trying to get all of the details in there, and the digging and going down multiple layers, and you just couldn't, you couldn't just write that in a paragraph.
So probably not in language that like a kid could understand. So
Yeah.
Especially in our day and age too, like with children nowadays, they don't see cemeteries like that whatsoever, and we kind of spoke about that too, like understanding that there's 3 levels to all of this. You buried somebody over top of somebody else and then somebody else too. I think that the visual definitely gave that impact that a child would need to. I do have a question that kind of parallels with it too. Go ahead, May.
Oh, I was just gonna say on more of like a lighthearted note, it helps the storytelling of all the like gross, silly things that happened, like the urgency for them to get to the restroom, the poop story, and then the one, I think it was a cousin who had like the snot bubble. You just, if you were to, it's like the same thing, Julie, when you were saying like when you take a road trip, you have all these funny stories, and it's like you want to show pictures that go along with it, because like the story itself just isn't going to do justice. You're like, you had to see what was happening, and so I think the graphic novel just helps add to that.
Well, and to add to that with the humor, I don't know how many kids today would understand the PP man.
fair enough.
When we went to south of the border when I was little, there were PP men all over the place, but I don't know if the PP man's there as much these days.
Probably not, but I remember it too.
Border, heck yeah, cultural landmark. I am glad, May, that you talked about the kid with the snot bubble, because that was the point that I referenced in my response to my follow-up question. And it's that without depicting this, it's on page 176 and 177. But I think it's poignant is the word I'm looking for. I'm not sure, but you'll notice that in the foreground, the kids are messing around with the pop rocks and the snot, and it's the funniest thing that's ever happened. But in the background, it's really, you can tell that like whatever's going on is really serious. It's an adult conversation. It's kind of that sincerity, stern, straight-faced interaction going on between two adults, and that really speaks to the mentality of like children versus adults, and how for Pedro and his siblings and cousin apparently, this vacation is just fun, lighthearted. We're in Mexico visiting family, and obviously for the adults in the family that there's something a lot more serious going on, weightier, and I don't think he could have explained something like that verbally. Like that, it's just really implicit that kids operate one way, obviously, is to be expected, and then adults another. And it could only really be depicted in imagery. Words just wouldn't set the tone quite the same way. And it's foreshadowing for, as Julie talked about, the grave scene.
I love that you brought that up, Laurel. Thank you. All right, Shannon, your last question.
So I have basically, it was interesting to see that his artistry adjusted from the novel itself to the comics he was writing within his own story and the telling of historic stories told from relatives. So, from pop art to pencil sketches to the vintage hues, color palette, do you feel that that helped control or expand the narrative even more? So we kind of really just talked about it, how it obviously enhances it and really allows it to like expand even further. Because just like with photographs, my niece, for example, we just went up into the attic and we grabbed this whole bin of these photos. And she's like, man, I wish I lived in y'all's days. She's like, these are great. And the tangible and seeing the flip of photo albums and everything where it like will move as you and it rotates as you go. And she's like, what? This is like the coolest thing ever. I wish we had things like that. We're just sliding, on the phone. But it's those types of things that we save those moments because it's like, oh, what happened here? And oh, what happened here? It sparks that, that ability to really be a part in the moment of what happened in that time and place versus just explaining it verbally. There's a visual component.
Yeah, and I think it was great how he used each of those different mediums and blended them so seamlessly into the narrative, where because each of them does have its own story to tell within the story, and it makes it really ties a lot of the coming of age story that's going on in it together really well.
Yeah, and it really differentiates those scenes from the light, like the historical ones, the ones about his grandfather, from the lightheartedness of the cartoon style of, Pedro's life. And also, I feel like in those scenes too, it's a lot less, this one is kind of a crazy one. It's a lot less colorful, like black and white, like it's the old days, that um, I think using that different art style really helped to distinguish those moments as, the historical moments or such.
It's also kind of a flex for his illustrative abilities. Like he's not one trick. He can illustrate in different color palettes, different hues, different styles, which obviously is appealing to a reader. But as an artist, I imagine that's quite satisfying to know that you're capable of doing that as well.
Awesome. Well, I'll ask my last question. I think we touched on it almost at the beginning of our conversation, so if we really don't have a lot to add, that's okay. But just what kind of an impact does the use of a mix of Spanish and English language being used in this book make? And why do you think the author, did this? And, we touched on that was his culture. He's a Mexikid, he's Mexican American family. Um, and yeah, you guys had any thoughts on it?
I think using his own, or allowing his parents to use their language and his grandfather to use his language, I think it just makes it even more diverse, and shows his background and how he had to grow up in this multicultural family and how it impacted his life and made him the person he is and had him develop. But also knowing that, it's funny, he didn't understand much Spanish, but his grandfather, who grew up in Mexico and who was obviously very Hispanic, knew enough English to communicate with him. So they had to muddle through that. And I think he did a great job of allowing the visuals speak for it and providing those context clues so that you would know what was going on. But it helps to really develop his character and knowing who he is and knowing what his family is more like as well, and just creating that tone, for being in a multicultural family. I think you kind of have to do that.
I also, I would love to hear from someone who is Spanish speaking who read this book, you know. Like I have a friend who is fluent in both Spanish and English, and when she talks to her parents, she's talking Spanish, and then just the rest of her life, she's using English. So, you know, reading it, when we read it, I skipped over the Spanish words because I didn't know what they were saying, you know? So, like, if you knew how to speak Spanish and read Spanish, it'd be such a different experience reading this book for you because you read all those blurbs too. So,
I'll be honest that I took the time to like Google Translate. Like I remembered some of my Spanish from back in the day, and then also from his translations and some of them, which is why I had mentioned why are some translated and not the others. Like there were some of those words I didn't know, whereas others it's like, yeah, I already caught that from that phrase. But I think a lot of it is also the merging of the two languages too, because when you're in that bilingual family and everything, and you're doing some American and then some of the Spanish, and it's they sometimes will merge together. And I think that has something to do with it too. The overlaps of, like you were saying, May, with your friends speaking Spanish to the family, but then is talking American to everybody else. So when they combine together, then you have the conversations in the background that some in one language and then another conversation forward. So I think that might have a lot to do with it too. It's just kind of really reflecting what life is like as Mexikid.
yeah.
I am gonna build on what you said, Shannon, because I think that speaks more to America as like a melting pot as well. And whether we want to admit it or not, there are still people who think like, oh, when you're in America, you should only speak English, but like that doesn't paint an accurate depiction of uh, America as a population and society, whether you're American born or not. Um, he's American born, he's an American citizen, and yet he still speaks, choppy Spanish, sure, but it's from his heritage, it's from his lineage. We wouldn't be where we are socially without the diversity that America possesses. So yeah, I think on like a microcosm, yeah, it like affects him and his family, but I think on a bigger scale, like this paints an idea of the fact that America isn't this homogenous society, which is a lesson that children should learn.
I agree completely. All right, my last question is based on the specific Mexican dad sayings that Martin highlights, like the Mexican Jedi mind trick and the dad whistle and the other Mexican dad memories that he provides about his dad. Do you think that Martin is trying to say that there is a typical Mexican dad? Or looking at it another way, or is he just saying that all dads are dads?
Yeah, I think that in different cultures and everything, you have like the, traditional, like this is, just the way things are because we're, we do things the way we do things and we're not going to change them. And I think that's kind of how like my grandfather's world was. My dad being an oops baby, he kind of merged into that a little bit, but then was like, you know what? Nope. And changed things dramatically compared to like how he grew up. So I think it's that cultural split too. But that the fact that they started in Mexico and then had moved to America and everything, I think that does, because time is still kind of stagnant over there versus where we are in America, where we've grown so much.
Yeah, I feel like
Go ahead, May. You're good.
just what some of uh how he like described his father like made me think of mine too. I feel like some of those things, like my dad's really cheap, so when he was talking about like, oh, we're gonna stay at this place, or like, oh, this where they're at, like the beautiful place they went out to eat, and then the dad was like, oh, too expensive, we're not doing that anymore. I feel like that, at least like personally, made me relate to it. So
I think maybe he also saw his dad in a different light in America versus Mexico because his dad was like really in his element and he was kind of being matched by like the expectations of Mexican culture, just kind of because the scene where they're in the restaurant and like the cockroach is on the menu, for example, how cavalier he is about the whole thing and is like, now is the cockroach like 4 pesos? And the waiter's like playing along with him. Americans would be mortified. They'd be like, oh my God, sir, I'm so sorry. We'll take this care of this immediately. And so I think he had this kind of like idea. And obviously we don't see how his dad interacted with others in America. So yeah, I think like things like the dad whistle and the Kmart in America probably speaks to like universal fatherhood. Like every dad has some kind of semblance of that, a way to like hail all their children. And then as soon as you get into the Mexican portion of the story, they become like more specific to his dad. There's also like the trick where he's like, oh, I used to work on the farm with your cousin or what. I'm like, that would not fly in America, but it works in Mexico. And he's like, wow, my dad is like really good at this. So it kind of, yeah, I think there are some things where it's hyper specific to just fatherhood in general, but then he's also really honing in on traits that he learned about his father on this trip specifically.
All right, it's all you, Laurel.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize we were okay. Last question. Why would Pedro Martinez include the scene with the deer, and what more was he trying to achieve than the discomfort and sadness that it evoked?
Can you imagine picking up a deer that was actually alive and ends up, or was actually alive but thought to be dead? Yeah, that's an experience.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I feel like it goes back to his father's experience growing up in Mexico and working so hard for everything they did get, and everything they had to work hard for all of the food, and they still do because the kid, I think Pedro and his family go out and like pick strawberries and such. So I feel like that seems like such a wild idea for someone to be like, oh, they hit a deer, I'm gonna take it home and it's gonna be dinner. But that was like their reality. Like they were gonna make do with what they had, and that was what they had, and that was free. That was a free meal. Um, and I grew up in Indiana in like deer country. People were always hitting deers with their cart, and that was like a joke. Like people were like, oh, you didn't bring the deer home. Like I don't really think that happened, but it was a joke. So I don't know. Like I said, I think that it was just showing what the father didn't grow up with, and that he had to make do with everything. And yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I do think that that was that to me. If that had happened in my family and things like that unfolded, I would have had to put it in my memoir. I mean, definitely. I can't imagine not putting something like that into my memoir if that had actually happened. So I thought that was just an amazing moment. The fact that he was going to cut off the leg and, you know, and that was what was, that was what was expected of him. And he was, he wasn't going to stop the Winnebago or anything until they were just going to keep on trucking on. Uh, I, I thought it was just, it was so typical of what his dad would do in that situation because I'm like, May, yeah, that was a big joke growing up around here as well because we've got a ton of deer. Talking about roadkill and as a matter of fact, when we were growing up, we always got my dad some kind of gag gift for Christmas. And one year, my brother got him a can of roadkill. It was like, like you get a can of soup and it just had roadkill on the label. So, I mean, it's one of those things that you just never expect it to happen, but It did, and yeah, if he had left that out, the book would not have been as good.
So, fun fact. So, this is rural talk going on, and it's definitely gonna pop out. So, one of the reasons why his dad was also probably driving the Winnebago so fast to get that, he's like, only so much to go. We've got to go fast. We got to go fast. And Pedro's connection was, oh, we got to save its life, but why don't we turn here? And he's like, we've got to go fast. And it's because when you have somebody hit an animal on the road and everything, there could be internal bleeding. So you have to go ahead and you have to be able to get to the animal and deblood and make sure that it doesn't affect the rest of the meat in order to make sure that it is going to be healthy eating. So, fun fact. I'm not saying that I'm picking deer off the road or anything. It's just facts that have been told to me over time, because I do have family who lived on farms and things like that. And it's like, you have to be quick about it. You don't just go and pick up a random possum off the road or, a deer off the road. You have to know exactly when they were hit. He saw the impact. So they were like, quickly, we got to grab it now, because they knew the amount of time that it takes before it spoils the meat. So just putting it out there.
So it's interesting that you guys like all talked about it from his dad's perspective and how that like paints the picture further of who his dad was, like kind of, the dad that Pedro may not know because he feels so Americanized at this point. But I also thought it was really interesting to kind of touch back onto the fact that like it's a coming of age story, and how there kind of comes a time in like every child's life, probably around the time that like how old Pedro was in this story, where like children will stop kind of placing their parents on a pedestal as these like omniscient beings. And I think Pedro believed that like his dad had everything under control. And by assuming that the deer was dead and he didn't, it was sheer chaos. I mean, that was probably of the entire book the fastest paced. I'm flipping the pages at a rapid pace, like trying to figure out what's going to happen. And I'm sure that very well mirrored like that feeling. And it's this kind of relief at the end when it's all over. But at the same time, like Pedro was like, oh my God, Dad, you messed that up. Like, how did you do that? And his mom's obviously like trying to kind of talk him down. I think it just kind of changed his perspective on how he viewed all of the adults in his family, because they all reacted differently, but to Pedro, like they were all kind of the wrong response. His gut instinct was to save the deer, and everyone's like, no, we're just let it thrash in the back. It's going to be fine. And I think it's interesting too, Julie, that you were talking about how like you just can't include that in the story, because yeah, like that's got to be like family legend now. That's story passed down for the ages. But what an impact it must have made to be there in that moment as a kid.
Yeah. Between that and the haircut, I mean,
Oh my God, it's atrocious.
yeah, I can't believe nobody asked a question about the haircut. Just saying.
I thought
went
about
through
it
the
as we were
photos in
reading.
the
I
back
saw
to
his
see.
hair, yeah.
Why do you think it was sprayed with tequila? Here's my question.
Oh, that was the sanitizing purpose, because when you're doing the actual razor and everything, if he got cut, because he did say ow a few times, so he had a few cuts that were back there, so he sanitized it. Because was he actually sanitizing the blade? Who knows? But at least he's going to sanitize the kid's neck.
Fair enough. Coming straight from the mouth, right to the neck. Fair enough.
All right, so how'd you rate it on Goodreads? How many stars?
4.3.
Okay.
No, I definitely would have given it a 5. I enjoyed reading through this a couple of times. So it was definitely something that there was always something that I found different as I kept on reading it. So just like your student, Julie, it's just one of those things where the more you read it too, it's like, oh, look at that. And oh, and now that we've had this discussion, guess who's reading it again? It's definitely something that you pick up on a lot more components each time.
Agreed. I
I
loved
will
it.
say the audiobook, Julie, it was fabulous. I mean, hearing them speak Spanish in it, it just added so much. And then the different voices that are used. But I hated Pedro's voice in the audiobook. I thought he was this annoying little kid, which then just like kind of added to like I mean, he probably was an annoying little kid, you know. And then um the Shapoopy song in the audiobook.
It was wrong.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It was annoying in the book, you know, for them, but then hearing it in the audiobook, every time it would come on, I would be like, no, please get this off.
Did you go back and actually listen to the real Shapoopy song?
Yes.
I did, yes. I remembered the movie after I started going, and I was like, oh, how did I not make this connection and everything? Because it had been hidden and thrown away in my memory for all of like the musicals and everything that I've watched over the years. And I threw that one out the window for a reason. And I think I figured out why. The words. I was just like, oh my gosh, I was listening to this as a teenager. I'm like mortified right now.
I forgot. I still have this recording going on. I'm going to stop the recording.
And my laptop's dying and I've got